So Bulletproofs Plus Plus is a new paper that is an improvement on our old Bulletproof protocol, which in turn is an improvement on our old Rangeproof protocol. Before Liquid, back in like 2015 or so, when we first developed confidential transactions, we created a scheme called a Rangeproof. So the idea behind confidential transactions is that rather than having amounts on your inputs and outputs, and you can kind of see where all the money's flowing, you have what are called Pedersen commitments. And these commitments, you prove in zero knowledge that they add to zero, so that each one commits to an actual value. So there's a real value on every input and output, but they're hidden, and you provide a zero knowledge proof that they all sum to zero. So we use what's called a range proof, which says we're in the range 0 to 2 to the 64. And we created and this is another kind of zero knowledge proof. We prove in zero knowledge that we're in the range, but nothing else. We developed a scheme in 2015, Greg Maxwell did, that at the time was the most efficient range proof in the literature that didn't have a trusted setup or any other weird crypto assumptions, which is funny because this wasn't that long ago, but these are just like horrifically inefficient. These 64-bit range proofs are like 4 kilobytes. And for context, a normal transaction output is like a public key and an amount is like 40 bytes of data. So we're adding 4,000 bytes to a 40-byte object. We wind up, like certainly 100xing the size of our outputs, but 10xing the whole transaction, right? Like even when you amortize it across the whole transaction is pretty rough. So we developed this scheme called Bulletproofs a few years later to use largely our friends at Stanford, Dan Boneh and Benedict Moons and John Boodle at University College London. We developed this new scheme called Bulletproofs. And now instead of being 4 kilobytes, 4,000 bytes, now the size is around 600 bytes. So like a tremendous improvement, like a 5x improvement in the total size of these things. And it was also roughly twice as fast to validate. And then a few years later, some researchers developed a new scheme called Bulletproofs Plus that was a little bit smaller and a little bit faster. And honestly, we didn't read the paper. Like we were going to, and we probably still would. But before we got around to it, this guy, Liam Egan, showed up and he developed this new paper called Bulletproofs Plus Plus. Okay, so he combined all of this. And the benefits of Bulletproofs Plus Plus are not only is it smaller and faster, so our 600-byte thing is now like 450 bytes or something. Like it's really small, as well as being faster. But it's also possible to combine proofs across a whole transaction. And this is possible, we call this aggregation. This is possible with the original Bulletproofs, but only if you had the same asset for all your outputs. So as soon as we introduced assets, like it broke this aggregation feature of Bulletproofs Plus Plus. So you couldn't, so we had these nice 600-byte proofs, but you needed a new one for every output. With Bulletproofs Plus Plus, we can combine them across an entire transaction with all of the assets, no matter how many different assets there. So you could have a giant transaction that's 10 inputs and 10 outputs and like 5 assets that are like all being mixed and matched and so forth. And you attach a single proof to this transaction, which is 500 or 600 bytes in size, and which takes just a couple milliseconds to verify. Versus the old Bulletproofs, which take 4 or 5 milliseconds per output kind of thing. And the original range proofs were 4 or 5 milliseconds. Bulletproofs were 2.5, and then Bulletproofs are a little smaller. But the big thing is that Bulletproofs are now per transaction instead of per output, which is a cool thing.